Hello and welcome everyone to our virtual seminar organized by the International Society for the Study of Early Medieval England. It is the last of our autumn series and we're very excited to have yet another brilliant paper lined up today. Let me remind you that these seminars are organized to showcase all of the exciting research that is going on within our field. We're trying to showcase all sorts of research ranging from archaeology to literature to language, presented by scholars from all walks of life and from all over the globe. And I'm very happy to see so many international people in the Zoom meeting today from England and Zurich and Paris and Malta and Santiago de Compostela, and also from France and Leiden, the Netherlands, but also more importantly from Adelaide, Australia. Which is where our distinguished speaker of today has found her home. Erin Sebo is an associate professor in medieval literature and language at Flinders University in Adelaide. She's also the research section head for literature, languages, culture and society, and she is lead investigator of two ARC discovery projects. The first one is called The First English Speakers in Their Own Words, and the second one is called Finding Friendship in Old English Literature. She's written a book on riddles, but there's also a forthcoming book on Beowulf. And we're very excited that we're going to get a little foretaste of that book, the penultimate chapter. So this paper may end with a bit of a cliffhanger, which forces us to all buy that book. So we're very excited to host Erin, and Erin, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, and thank you for such a lovely introduction. So I would like to begin today by acknowledging the Kaurna people, the traditional custodians of the land from which I speak to you today, and to pay my respects to their elders past and present, and to extend those respects to any Torres Strait Islander and Aboriginal people who are here today. I want to talk about queens in Beowulf, and particularly the role of queens in feuds in Beowulf. As Ty says, this is from my book on Beowulf, and one of the things that I try to do in this book is to move away from thinking about Beowulf in terms of genres or literary tropes or literary conventions, and to think about it more in terms of it is a poem which speaks about cultural and emotional dynamics that would have resonated with the audience themselves. So in speaking about women in Beowulf, I actually want to start somewhere slightly unusual, in that I want to start with Widsith. And that's because right at the very beginning of Widsith, there is a reference to Ealhilde. And it's the only reference in the tradition. It's very slight. It just says that along with her retainer Widsith, she is traveling to marry Eormenric. And although the tone of this is very neutral, this is quite a heart-stopping moment, because Eormenric is depicted uniformly throughout all the sources, across all the traditions, as violent, paranoid, and vindictive. In Widsith, as you see on the left, he is described as wrathful against traitors. In Deor, he is described as someone with a wolfish mind. He is a king for whom it is a misery to be a warrior under his leadership. And the poem talks about the way the warriors hope for his downfall. In Beowulf, there are references to his cruel enmity. And in Scandinavian and Roman sources, of course, he is also an uxorcide, a wife killer. So this is what Ealhilde is facing in this journey. And although we never hear anything about her ever again, she is really an extraordinary figure, because right at the end of Widsith, Widsith tells us that he lives in Eormenric's court for the whole of his reign, and that Eormenric is very good to him. And this is literally the only positive reference to Eärmanric anywhere in any tradition. So Eärhild has done what she was sent to do. She has actually prevailed upon Eärmanric to be benevolent towards her people. And this idea of this kind of emotional dynamic as a way of resolving conflicts, resolving feuds, has been a real source of fascination for me. Because on the one hand, it assumes that the desire to pursue revenge is overwhelmingly strong, at least in men. And it also assumes that women are able to put aside their grief and trauma to the extent that they are able to nurture other people's and develop other people's emotions. And in this context, I want to look at the passage in Maxims that talks about what is expected of women. And it says that women must thrive in love with her people. She must inspire them to love her. She must be cheerful-minded, hold good counsel, be generous. And when I first read these lines as an undergraduate, I was quite dismissive of them. I felt that they were part of a long tradition of encouraging women to be meek and pleasing. But now it seems to me that it's actually something quite different, and that this is a passage actually about that extraordinary kind of emotional feat that women are asked to perform in these kinds of aristocratic marriages. Because the situation is almost always that they are going to marry a man who has been instrumental in killing their relatives and their friends. And when they get to the court, they are almost certainly going to be surrounded by people who are also grieving and in trauma for the loss of their family and friends at the hands of the woman's family. So this idea that the woman has to be the still point in the center of this, who is able to put aside her own emotions and then encourage more positive emotions in other people, is an extraordinary dynamic. And one of the things I want to argue in this paper is that there is a kind of equivalence to what is asked of aristocratic men and aristocratic women in the poem. Different expressions, but it is a similar kind of courage and a similar kind of fate. And one of the things that interests me too is I think that there is evidence in the broader literary corpus for the depiction of women who are just not able to put aside their grief in that way, or their emotions in that way. I would suggest that the narrator of Wolf and Eardwatcher is an example of that. I won't go into it here, but you can read my article on it below. And I've also argued, along with my former student and now colleague, Dr. Cassandra Schilling, that Modthryth is an example of this too. I know many scholars read Modthryth as unmarried when we first meet her, but she is introduced to us right at the beginning as a queen already and as a peace weaver. And there is a reference to the idea that the men look at her in a way that would only be appropriate at night from her great lord. And this seems to me to be a comment that has sexual reference. And so the idea that the great lord refers to her father and not her husband is not very convincing to me. If she is married, this also explains her extreme vindictiveness, which then disappears as soon as she is removed from that situation. And one of the things that interests me about the Modthryth passage is that although the poet absolutely talks about her as an extreme, violent and problematic person, the poet also has considerable sympathy for her. I also think it's interesting that the poet says that killing people unjustly, having people put to death unjustly, is not a queenly custom. It's not the right thing for a noble woman to do. but it's not the right thing for anyone to do. The poet doesn't ever encourage unjust or violent or vindictive kingship anywhere in the poem. So it seems to me that the only reason that it would be important to stress the female aspect of this is because it is so particularly the excellence that is asked from women that they stand away from this. And as I said, I think it's really interesting that when she's removed from that situation, the poet actually spends considerable time talking about what a good leader she is, but also how happy she is. Beowulf is not really a poem that spends very much time talking about happiness. It spends a little bit of time talking about misery, but actually emotions are only sparingly described, and most often in relation to women. So here is a list of, I think, the major female figures in Beowulf. You'll notice that up till now, I have been very carefully skirting around the word peace weaver. Peace weaver, of course, is a highly contested term. And I don't really want to get bogged down in that debate. Apart from anything else, Megan Cavall, I think, has written on it extremely persuasively, and I've listed her article below. What seems to me significant is not really whether there is a particular category of woman who counts as a peace weaver, but the fact that almost all the women that we have here are deeply engaged in politics, and almost all of them are engaged one way or another in feud. Almost all of them, possibly all of them, are married exogamously, so they're being married outside their kinship group, which presumably is to perform a diplomatic function. Most of them are engaged in solving feuds. Some of them are simply just caught in the middle of feud and are not able to extract themselves. Two, very famously, make really significant and important political decisions, Wealhtheow and Feuds, and in both cases, they do this against the advice or the opinions of really very powerful men. And in both cases, although scholars have been surprised by this, none of the characters in the poem show any sign that they think that it is unusual for women to exercise that kind of power. So given this, I think it's interesting that I think the consensus is still that this is an overwhelmingly masculine poem. I'm quoting Overin, of course, a very influential article on this, book on this, sorry, excuse me. But I think that one of the reasons for that is that we have very carefully constructed a patriarchal framework for reading this poem. So the passage that refers to Modthryth and that is absolutely concerned with her thoughts, her feelings, her actions, her life, we refer to as the offer digression. The passage that is concerned with Hildeberg, her actions, her thoughts, her life, we refer to as the Finnsburg episode. And scholars routinely look to outside texts so that they can introduce male concerns, male narratives into these passages, because in both cases, the poet tells us almost nothing about the men who are engaged in this. We get only as much as we need to know to understand how the women feel and the situation that the women are in. And on the other hand, our namings conventions have also had the effect of foregrounding and also in some cases elevating masculine concerns in the poem. So Hrothgar's sermon, which is of course the namesake of my paper, is a very good example of this. This is at Muller's term, and it has had the effect of signaling that this is the moral center of the poem. But I think it's important to remember the context of Hrothgar's speech here. He has just had a foreign warrior kill an enemy that he could not defeat himself. So one of the things he is doing in this sermon is telling Beowulf not to be overly vain for having shown exactly the qualities that he, Hrothgar, has not been able to show in this moment. And he talks about how these are qualities which fail at some point. In fact, he is so concerned to reframe this episode and to re-establish his own authority here. And remember, the poet actually goes out of their way to say that Hrothgar's men don't blame him, which implies that that must at least be a question in the audience's mind. Hrothgar is so concerned to reframe this that he actually rewrites the Heremod story. So the Danish bard has already told us the Heremod story, and he has said that Heremod is a bad king and a destructive king to his people because he becomes lazy and reluctant to engage in fights, which is arguably has parallels, at least, with Hrothgar's behavior. So when Hrothgar retells the story of Heremod, he says that the thing that makes Heremod a terrible king is that he's too bloodthirsty, that he's too reckless, that he's too concerned to engage in fights. And one of the things that's interesting about thinking about Hrothgar's sermon is that the advice he gives Beowulf is perhaps not so useful to Beowulf in the end. The kinds of threats that Beowulf faces, I'm not convinced at least, are actually the things that Hrothgar warns him against. Sorry, let me just skip that. Having established these kinds of frameworks for thinking about the poem, encourages scholars, I think, to overwrite those moments when we find passages in the poem that really are concerned with women. So I've picked this example from Richard North, partly because it sets up something else that I would like to say. But it's a really intriguing quote, and it's a really intriguing idea, and it has found a certain amount of traction. So Richard North notes that when Beowulf gets home, having killed Grendel and Grendel's mother, that he spends a lot of time talking about Freya-Waru's marriage, the marriage between the Danish princess and the Heather Bards. And what he argues is that Freya-Waru was of so little importance that it is just inconceivable that Beowulf would talk about her as though she were important. And he actually extrapolates from this a whole episode for which there is no internal evidence in the poem in order to explain the idea that Beowulf keeps behaving as though she is important. And he actually argues that the only other possible reading here is that the poet has actually lost control of the poem. But it seems to me that actually there is reason for thinking that Freya-Waru is an important figure, and it does make sense that Beowulf talks about her. Partly, this is a major international incident, it's major international news, and it is useful for the Yiddish king to know that there is a potential truce, a potential alliance, and it's also useful to know that Beowulf does not think it will be successful. In fact, what Beowulf has done in killing Grendel solves a much more local problem than what Freya-Waru is doing in marrying Ingeld. Grendel is a problem for the Danes, but not really for anyone else. And he's not even a massive problem for the Danes. He's been attacking for 12 years. And as long as nobody sleeps in the hall, actually, their lives can continue more or less uninterrupted. It is certainly an insult to their honor. Hrothgar talks about it as a misery, but it's not actually a major practical problem. In fact, in many ways, Grendel is actually a hall guardian, which is what the poet calls him. And perhaps not so ironically, because for as long as Grendel is attacking the hall, nobody is going to make a challenge for the Danish leadership. As soon as Grendel is killed, the possibility of a feud becomes instantly more likely. They are instantly worried about a challenge from Hrothulf, the nephew, but also from the Heather Bards. And in fact, when Grendel is very first introduced, just before he is introduced, the poet tells us that Grendel isn't going to be the problem. The hall will be destroyed in the end. The Danes will be overcome, but it will be through the feud. It will be through the Heather Bards. So we always know that the Heather Bards are actually going to be the issue here for Hrothgar. Of his two problems, the feud is the much more serious one. Beowulf takes care of the local issue, the monster. One of the great things about monsters is you only have to kill them once and then they're dead. Feuds can endlessly reignite. And that's the problem that Freyawaru is charged with solving. So it seems to me quite natural, actually, that Beowulf would speak about it in the way that he does. And it's intriguing, again, that he puts so much emphasis on how entirely unable the men are to control their emotions, how easily they are provoked to feud again. But he also talks at some length about the position that this leaves Freyawaru in, particularly if her husband falls out of love with her and how isolated that makes her. Beowulf's mother is also a woman caught in the middle of at least one feud, but I think probably two. So it perhaps makes sense that this is a concern for Beowulf. Yes. Okay. So one of the things about the poem, of course, is the endless contrast between the monster fights and the historical passages. And for early scholars, they were much more interested in the historical passages. But from Tolkien on, of course, the emphasis has been on the monsters. And we tend to think about the periods in between, almost like negative space in the poem, as digressions. But actually, these digressions are quite focused on the stories of women too. In between the death of Grendel and the attack of Grendel's mother, we get a series of stories about women caught in the middle of feuds. First of all, we have the Shop's praise song, which refers to the Volsungs. In this case, he doesn't refer specifically to Signy, but the legendary context is that Signy absolutely drives that feud. Some scholars argue that Signy is a later figure, but I think there is good reason to think that she is there in the earliest versions. This is the passage too, where Beowulf's mother is mentioned, almost the only time she's mentioned in the poem. Beowulf's mother is married to the man who starts the greatest feud, according to Hrothgar. But there is also an argument that her marriage may have been designed to resolve the Swedish-Yiddish wars. Erin Sebo makes the argument. I think it's extremely persuasive. And again, I put her article below. Then we get the story of Hildeberg. This is the Shop's second story. And this is entirely focused on Hildeberg's emotions. It starts, Hildeberg had no cause to praise the good faith of the Eärtons. And the whole story as it unfolds is around what she does, what she experiences, and particularly what she feels. And then we have Wealhtheow. I was at Leeds this year, and Wendy Hennequin pointed out that Wealhtheow speaks the most of any character in the poem after Beowulf and Hrothgar. And in this instance, she uses her public speech to protect her own sons, who are in danger of being caught in the middle of a feud with their older and very ambitious cousin, Bothel, who is angling for the Danish leadership. And it's at that point that Grendel's mother is attacked. So we've had a whole series of women who are caught in the middle of feuds. And then we have Grendel's mother, who is also caught in a feud. Even being a monster doesn't save you from being caught in the middle of feuds if you're a woman in Beowulf. We see something like the same kind of thing when Beowulf goes back to Sweden. As I've already said, the passage begins with a discussion of Hugh, not Hugelac actually, but Hugh and Modthryth. And then we get Beowulf's own account, which is focused very heavily on Wealhtheow and Freyawaru. And as I've already indicated, Wealhtheow in particular, and she is the one I really want to focus on for the last part of the poem, speaks with immense authorities. She finishes her last speech the warriors, having drunk at my table, will do as I command. And again, when we go back to the maxims, the model is actually of kings and queens ruling together. And there is a sense that queens need to be strong in counsel, strong in advice, and to understand the role of kings, to understand what is good strategy for kings to undertake. So they're charged not only with understanding their own role, but also the king's role. So I want to focus for a minute on what I'm calling Wealhtheow's sermon, which is the advice that Wealhtheow leaves Beowulf with. Beowulf speaks to Wealhtheow, particularly in the last part of the poem, with immense deference. He makes particular kinds of commitments to her in relation to the Grendel-kin. But this speech that she gives, which is very much focused on her own situation, in particularly on the welfare of her sons, is a model for the kinds of qualities that Beowulf, I think, exhibits as a king. And there is a great deal of emphasis on kindness, mildness, gentleness, cooperation, collaboration, strengthening the nation. Beowulf is seen typically, or through a long scholarly tradition, as a kind of heroic ideal, sometimes an ideal of kingship, sometimes an ideal of Christian warrior ethos. And in some cases, so much so that he's even seen as being kind of two-dimensional. But actually, I think he's a rather unconventional hero and an unconventional character. His own childhood is much closer to the kind of experience of the women in Beowulf that I have been describing. His parents, I suggest, are married in the context of solving a feud. At the age of 7, he is then fostered to his mother's people. So he presumably grows up in that context with whatever that kind of baggage is. And then, of course, his father is exiled for starting a feud himself. So Beowulf is always kind of in the midst of these sorts of conflicts. He's also, of course, in the position that his uncles, one of his uncles kills the other. And the poem is never quite prepared to commit itself on how intentional that is. But it has an effect, of course, on who becomes king. And it also leads to the death of his grandfather. And again, I think the implication in the poem is the suicide of his grandfather. So he's very much shaped by these traumatic and extreme emotional events, I suggest. Oh, sorry, and I wanted to say one of the things I want to argue here, I want to reinstate Maury's, or return to Maury's argument that there is a kind of androgynous element to Beowulf's heroism, that actually he starts to take on the models of the queens much more than the models of the kings. So these are a list of his unconventional decisions. He doesn't marry, he doesn't produce an heir, he doesn't adopt an heir. He has a non-interventionist foreign policy, which is pretty unusual in this poem. He actively avoids power whenever he can. He doesn't kill humans. He is almost suicidally delighted to kill monsters, but he's much, much more reluctant to get involved in conflicts with humans. He doesn't seem to have any close friends. He doesn't carry his father's sword, and he doesn't refer to himself as his father's child. The Beowulf poet always refers to him as Wealhtheow's bane, but Beowulf always refers to himself as Shushalak's kinsman. And I think this childhood perhaps explains this rather odd thing that the poet tells us after Beowulf has produced these extraordinary kind of feats of bravery in killing the monsters. The poet tells us that as a child, he is despised as being lazy, And I wonder if that means reluctant to be involved in battles. We certainly know that he's prepared to challenge Breca to the swimming contest, but perhaps reluctant to get involved in battles. And that the episode with Grendel changes people's opinion of him. When Beowulf is summing up his achievements, and I've used Harris's synopsis here because I think it's so good and so clear, these are very much things in line with what Wealhtheow advises him to do. Long reign, good relationships with his neighbours, non-aggressive foreign policy. He doesn't swear false oaths. And he doesn't kill his kinsmen. Again, in quite stark contrast to some of the other kings in the poem. And again, as Maury notes, and I want to pick it up again, and this will be the point I finish on, the adjectives that are used in Wealhtheow's sermon are the ones that are used of Beowulf right at the end of the poem when the poet is summarising, when the people, the Yiddish people themselves, are giving their account of Beowulf. These adjectives aren't used anywhere in the poem, only in these two places. And it really is, I think, an extraordinary example of the influence of that speech on Beowulf's kingship overall. So I'm going to leave it there. Thank you very much.